Welcome to an introduction to the TPACK framework. My name is Punya Mishra. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. I'd like to start by going back in time to June 23rd, 1870, when India and England were first joined by undersea cable. As you can imagine, this was an amazing technical achievement. However, George Bernard Shaw, when he heard that news, is reported to have said, "That's wonderful, but what are they going to talk about?" And I think that that's an important question that resonates even today when we look at all these different tools and technologies that we have for technology to be used in education. And clearly, these new tools provide new opportunities, but I think Bernard Shaw's question of "that's wonderful, but what are they going to do with it?" is an important one that we need to think about as we look at technology in education. I've been working in this field, particularly with my colleague Matthew Kaler here at Michigan State for a whole bunch of years. And we have focused on the question of what is it that teachers need to know in order to successfully integrate technology in their teaching. And I think that the key challenge that we face when we talk about technology is the rapid rate at which technologies are changing. So for instance, this is one of my favorite charts, and it shows how technologies have changed over time from 10,000 generations ago, speech, which is what sets us apart from the rest of the species on the planet. And then the next change, agriculture, took around 9,000, 250 years. And then you can see that writing is 500 generations ago, libraries are 400 generations ago, and so on. So one important thing to notice here is that change is getting increasingly faster and faster. So we have computers 2 generations ago, internet and email 1 generation ago. And if you have teenagers like I do, you know that they regard email as being for old people. And then we live in a world which looks like this. All these different kinds of tools, technologies, software, websites, what have you, throw into the mix something like social media, and you're looking at a very different world that our kids are growing up in. Now, something like Facebook or Twitter was not invented in order to foment change in the world. But if you look at things like the Arab Spring, you realize that these tools and technologies are fundamentally changing the way we engage and interact with each other and with knowledge and information. So when I was growing up, I think this image would represent how information is to come at me. The world today is very different. Information comes at us something like this. And so the issue here becomes not that much of going and accessing information as being able to filter, critically evaluate, and judge the information that's coming. And again, if you see an image like this where it's like drinking out of a fire hose, it's no surprise that many educators feel like this. This is an actual sculpture at the University of Twente, and I went back 6 months later and in winter, and this guy was still there. Be that as it may, keeping up with technology really is the least of the problems that we face. I think the biggest challenge we face when we are talking about technology is that we need to move beyond a paradigm which is technocentric, a paradigm which says, I love technology for the sake of technology. And that is important because education is much more than about just learning about the tools and the technologies. We cannot ignore content and pedagogy, which are two very important aspects of what we as educators do. Teaching is always about, teaching and learning are always about some subject matter, concept, ideas, knowledge that we want transferred, and pedagogy is the approaches that we use to transfer that knowledge. So technology, though, plays an important role in both how and what we teach. So I want to take each of these in turn. So looking at technology and how it changes what we teach. One of the single biggest innovation that's happened, educational innovation that's happened in our lifetime, is the World Wide Web, particularly the search engine. The fact that any kid somewhere in Botswana or in Nigeria or in New Delhi or in East Lansing, Michigan, has access to information, the amounts of information that was not possible before. I think it's an amazing, amazing technology that we have developed. This is a map of all the pages on Wikipedia devoted to certain geographical locations. As you can see, it's not fully balanced across the world, but it is an amazing resource. You combine that with open courseware, such as from MIT or the Open Courseware Consortium, resources like the Khan Academy, bring in Web 2.0 and user-generated content, bring in schools where children bring their own devices to school, and you look at the growth of online learning, and maybe the most recent trend that's happened is the massively online open courses. If you look at each of these, you will realize that this technology fundamentally changes the kind of pedagogy that we need to bring in. You cannot teach the same way to a class in a massively online open course as you would in a regular face-to-face classroom or in an online class or one class where children bring their own devices to school. The pedagogy has to change to meet these new demands of technology. But that's more. So that's where we talked about how technology changes how we teach. Technology also changes what we teach. So if you look at any field of human activity, whether it's mathematics, music, science, physics, engineering, art, history, political science, what have you, they've all been transformed due to technology. So mathematicians today use computers to do simulations. Musicians create their music using digital media, share their music using digital media, sell their music using digital media. So each and every aspect. And technology has always done that. Technology has always changed the world and how we look at the world. So the microscope, for instance, completely opened up a new universe that now scientists and biologists and chemists had to deal with. My favorite example of a technology and how it changes the way we represent things is that of the periodic table. So if you see this periodic table, you'll see there's a whole series of elements down below called the lanthanide and actinide series, which are kept separate from the table. Turns out that this is actually a better representation of the table, but we typically get this one, not this one. And the answer as to why is because it's the technology of print that prevented people from including this longer version in the textbooks. Now with the advent of digital media, with iPads and laptops and so what have you, there are many, many different representations of the periodic table that we can now expose to our students. Similarly, if you look at the ability to draw, to create these little applications, applets on the web that allow you to understand mathematical functions, new tools such as the Connect, which allow you to engage and interact with data and information in new kinesthetic ways, technology clearly changes the content of what we teach as well. So technology changes both the pedagogy and the content. And where does all this happen? And all of these happen in specific contexts. So for instance, if you have a one-on-one classroom where every child has a laptop, that's a very different context than this one. A school in India where children maybe get a computer for an hour or two in a week, where they have to share machines where the internet access may or may not be available, as opposed to this one where children have iPads that they can walk around with, take pictures with. Clearly the kinds of pedagogical decisions that one makes would be different in these contexts. Contexts go beyond sort of the immediate classroom, so you could have rules and regulations such as this one, which thankfully was upturned by a judge, but it did, at one point, they did ban student and teachers interacting on Facebook. Or this one, where students in Denmark were allowed full access to the internet during exams. I think the important thing to think about is that what happens when you do something like that? Can you ask questions about what is the capital of Mali? You have to ask questions which have to do with assessment and evaluation and critical thinking. And this was the response from the ministry, where they said that some of the steps taken to avoid cheating, for example, were to ask how and why rather than when or who questions, because clearly you could look up those on the internet. So, to sum up what we have talked about so far, technology changes how we teach the pedagogy, what we teach the content, and the contexts within which this teaching and learning happens. So coming back to our original question, what is it that teachers need to know? Clearly, teachers need to know about the subject matter that they have to teach, the content, strategies for teaching that, the pedagogy, and the tools and technologies that we have today. However, we should not see these in being in isolation from each other, but rather think of it as an overlapping set of circles. So for instance, this way, where technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge all come together at that sweet spot in the center, which is where we argue, Matt and I have argued that all teaching and learning takes place. So when we first wrote about it, we talked about the kinds of knowledge teachers need to have as being an integrated form of knowledge of technology, pedagogy, and content, and we called it the TPCK framework when we first wrote about it. And of course, it brought up questions like how we're supposed to pronounce this. Friends of ours, well, maybe not so good friends of ours, suggested we call it the toothpick framework. And so being academics, we write grants. So we wrote a grant for $50 and we bought a vowel. And that made the TPCK framework into the TPACK framework. And so that's the technological, pedagogical, and content knowledge framework, which is the kinds of knowledge that teachers need to have to intelligently integrate technology in their teaching. Another way of thinking about it is that it is the total package of knowledge that a teacher needs to have. So essentially what we are arguing, whether we are teaching with a slate, because that's a technology too, or a computer, or the web, teaching is and always has been about TPACK. Just a little bit of history. The key article in this was written in 2006. It's been cited lots of times. There was a handbook of TPCK. This is before we bought the vowel, clearly. So the handbook of TPCK published by AACTE in 2008. A whole host of associations and groups have taken on this framework and used it to develop standards, to talk about how teacher professional development and teacher education should happen. There are over 200 plus journal articles, 25 plus dissertations that have used this framework. It's used across the country and the world. So for instance, San Diego School District uses it for professional development. Of course, the Microsoft TEI project used the TPACK framework as well. An important resource for all of you would be tpack.org website, where there's a bibliography. There are lots of resources that you can use. This site is maintained by my friend Matt Kaler. What's important to remember is that what doesn't work is that if we look at professional development or teacher education of these three pieces as being taken separate from each other, where content is taught separately, pedagogy is taught separately, and technology is taught separately. There's enough research to show that in each of these, if done this way, that teachers do not end up integrating technology intelligently or at all in their teaching. So what we have to think about is taking these pieces together and thinking of the context within which they work. An important aspect to think about is that technology, when brought into teaching, does not just acts as a substitution, but actually transforms how we think about teaching. So we go from just using technology to integrating technology, and I think the important thing to think about is innovating with technology. So we'd like to talk about how technology can help us see the world of teaching and learning as long as we see technology the right way. Three quick examples. The first one is from a high school in Italy where they computed the distance to the moon using freely available resources on the web. So basically they went to the nasa.gov website and downloaded the MP3 of the conversation between mission control and the astronauts. And what they heard, if you listen carefully, is a slight echo, sort of what we get when we have a transatlantic call, right? So essentially the voice, the electrical signals, the sound, would go all the way to the moon and bounce back, and you would hear that slight echo. And they took that and they put this in an open source software called Audacity, which allowed them to actually measure the time difference between the original sound and its echo. And once you have that duration, you can divide it by 2 and multiply by the speed of light. It will give you the distance to the moon. And they got it accurate enough that they could actually tell when the moon was closer to the Earth than it was further away. What's interesting to me in this is the way that they use Audacity, which is sort of a software for manipulating audio as a data analysis tool. So this is the kind of small c creativity that we'd like teachers to see, where they look at a tool for its affordances and what they can do with it for particular pedagogical and content-related goals. Our second example is from our master's program, where we had students trying to represent visually through photographs what we call different kinds of tensions in education. The only constraint was that they'd have to have multiple pictures of themselves. So for instance, here is one of a student talking about individual versus collaborative learning. This is a very fun and interesting, but a quick and easy project to do. And the reason I give this as an example is not because I want to talk about a master's program, but rather how one teacher, this one, took that assignment and used it in their geometry class, where they were talking about transformations, rotation, reflection, and translation, and the kids were creating these images on their own. And she used our Facebook group, which continues beyond the sort of graduation. Again, another use of social media for keeping in touch with students, and let us know about how this project had gone in her classroom. The third example, again continuing to speak of mathematics, are these little applets which I've mentioned before, which allow you to see function in kinesthetic and visual terms, which is a very different way of thinking about mathematical function than just graphing them. with new tools such as the Connect and the software that people are developing now with Connect Math, you can actually do a lot of very interesting ways of thinking about function and velocity and speed and things that way through just walking back and forth towards and away from the Connect computer. Again, changing the way we relate with mathematics and understanding of mathematical ideas. And what I'd like to ask yourself is, what do these examples tell us? Would something like this have been possible 100 years ago, 10 years ago? Would they have been possible 5 years ago? And then the question is, what will be possible 5 years from now? And so how do we prepare our teachers and instructors and faculty, and through them the students who are in our care? So I think that the TPACK framework allows us to think about bringing all of these together in an integrated and thoughtful way. So to sum up, we live in a new ecology of media and technology where standard solutions don't necessarily work, and it is about creativity, about teacher creativity and student creativity, and we get there. It's not a process of magic, it's a thoughtful development of TPACK. Thank you very much. This is my contact information. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or comments. Thanks again. Bye-bye.